there is a bit of urgency because it's clear that right now the attackers have gotten a bit of the upper hand. There's a lot of technology advancement that helps the attacker to bypass the phishing filters. The AI is happily helping the attackers to craft beautiful letters, phishing emails. So there is a need to kind of continuing the improvement journey and continuing the resilience. And this is a quite good tool in your toolbox.
This is Identity at the Center. If it has anything to do with IAM, this is the go-to podcast. Now your hosts, Jim McDonald and Jeff Stedman.
Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and there's no Jim today. He is on assignment. I've given him a vacation. He's in lovely Chicago, hopefully getting some Portillo's, maybe some shaku. But you've got just me today, but I'm not alone. I've got my friend Martin. He's going to join us here in a second. But before I do that, I want to, again, thank everybody for reaching out over the last week or so since we put out our 5th year anniversary episode. It's been very great and very humbling to read a lot of the comments have been out there. So definitely appreciate that. And we're going to just keep the train rolling. So before we get too far along, do want to mention that we are partnered up with the Identity Week conference that's happening later this year. So we have America, which is September 11th and 12th. That's in DC. Jim and I are both going to be at that. And hopefully people can attend and come see us. I'm going to be doing some sort of panel, to be determined. We'll figure that out. And we'll probably be doing podcast things. And then there's also the one in Asia in Singapore, which is October 22nd, 23rd. We've got discount codes for that. IDAC30 gets you 30% off of your registration. So hopefully people could take advantage of that and come out and see us at one of those. We'll also be at Authenticate in October. Still working on the discount code for that and get that published as soon as we've got it. But lots of opportunities to come see us. And let's see what else. There's also some regional events taking place for Identiverse in November, I believe, in both New York City and Chicago. I may or may not be attending one or both of those. We'll see how things go, but want to make people aware of that. I did go to the one last year in New York City, and I thought it was great. I think it was the first time they had done that. So kudos to Cyber Risk Alliance and putting that kind of stuff out there. I think it's great when we get like identity meetups happening. So I'm talking a mile a minute, so let's get right into it as we introduce our guest today. His name is Martin Sandrin. He's the IAM Product Lead for IKEA. Welcome to the show, Martin.
Thank you very much. I'm one of your listeners. I'm very happy to be on the actual show.
Well, I understand this is probably a career highlight from you and being on the podcast, and you're joining us from the Netherlands and in Amsterdam, I believe, is what we had established. And you're 7 hours ahead. So you're coming to us from the future, so to speak. Tell us a little bit about Martin. How did you get into the world of identity and access management?
Yeah, so I actually landed in this because when I was at university, so I'm originally from Sweden. So I went to university in Sweden and I started working as a system administrator in the labs. And I was supposed to be a chemical engineering major, but then I found computers more fun than building towers. So I switched over to computer science. And then when I did my thesis work, I was looking at integrating ERP systems with LDAP authentication, like standardized authentication. And then I kind of landed into the world of security and ERP systems, and then took a job in Germany, and then I went into consulting in the IAM space back in 2005, and started doing implementation of Tor Accelerate, which a little bit later became OIM, and then I got stuck.
You got stuck, but now you're with IKEA working on IAM stuff there. How long total have you been in the identity space?
So depends a little bit how we count, but about 15 to 20 years, if you count when I did a little bit of other things than just IAM as well. But quite a long time now.
Is there anything from your chemical engineering background that you think has translated to the identity space?
Well, it's interesting because some of the stuff that you do in AI, for example, how you use machine learning and peer, it's actually stuff that was kind of invented for how to optimize chemical engineering, distillery towers, for example, back in the late 19th century. But when you don't really have a clue of how anything works, you can use these data points and peering to figure out how to get some form of a control of a sample and of outcomes. So it's a little bit useful, although not very useful.
Useful for other things, maybe, but I think some of the lessons probably, hopefully, will apply. It's interesting about the AI parallel that you're drawing. I know we're going to talk about passkeys, and we didn't really kind of talk about this ahead of time, but give me your thoughts real quickly on AI in the identity space. Where do you see things currently, and where do you think they go, or where do you want them to go, maybe, from an AI perspective?
Well, I think you have the kind of the cop and the consigliere concept. So we want to use the AI to focus limited resources on the right things. So, for example, you can use that to focus in on the right recertifications that are out of band, or you can help in ITDR-like cases where you really want that your limited SOC resources focus on the most interesting cases. There is also the use cases where you see, for example, generating descriptions of groups and similar things. So I do think that there's some quite interesting parts, but it's also a little bit like, a couple of years ago, everything was zero trust.
Mm-hmm.
So it does right now. It kind of more helps the attackers in some ways. For example, with AI, you can write beautiful, really nice phishing letters, and also in languages that didn't exist before. For example, some Icelandic banks that discovered that suddenly was financially feasible to write phishing letters in Icelandic with AI translations. So it's going to be very interesting to see how it's going to help the defense as well.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of runway, and the book is just starting to get written on this topic. So I'm always curious when I talk with others in this space of where they think things are going, or what they're kind of seeing in the real world. I do want to talk about passkeys, though, because I think that's really kind of be the main thrust of our conversation. And you presented at EIC just last month around this topic. I guess let's start with your general thoughts around passkeys. Is it hype? Is it real? Where do you stand right now?
So again, I think it's a quite wide kind of topic, and it's still very, very early game with real implementations. If you look at what we have been using it for, it's primarily in kind of a proof of concept approach to see, can it be used to provide more phishing resistance for the high and highest admins? So, of course, you have a situation where, MFA has become ubiquitous. Like everyone, like you can't have a PAM system where you don't have MFA authentication today. It's not, it won't really be a serious system. But the interesting part there is, of course, that some of the technologies that I think, at least I thought that the push technology was really strong. Why would you need anything more? But what we are seeing is that the SMS has been defeated. There's just a lot of different attacks, and you can add all the operational problems you can get to SMS. If you look at push, there's a number of ways that you can overwhelm a person or an admin. So the phishing resistance of push technologies with apps and similar is limited. So then you, of course, start looking at alternatives. And there you have things like hardware keys, which are great, but of course, very expensive. And not only because they cost some money to actually purchase, but primarily because they are expensive to distribute. And it's a little bit of, I remember like 15 years ago when everyone had the little generators from RSA and similar, and you spent a lot of your time on kind of distributing those across global companies.
It's a nightmare for me that I relive trying to distribute RSA tokens to people and seed files, and what happens when you need to replace it. It's a problem.
Yeah, and it's, of course, when you're a global company, then you kind of need to figure out a way to support this global. And of course, there are companies that can help you with this as well, but it's quite large investment. And then you always have the discussion, especially everyone is trying to make sure to control costs, and adding a quite expensive technology is something that people are really reluctant to do, of course.
Mm-hmm.
So with the passkeys, and of course, there's lots of different use cases for it, but what we looked at was basically to see, can we use this as a way to provide better, stronger phishing resistance compared to what you have from a authentication app at still a more quite a low cost compared to rolling out hardware keys. And that's been quite an interesting journey. Of course, some of it, it's just become generally available. And when we did the piloting, one thing we saw is that you require quite new mobile phones. So the OS needs to be very kind of fresh. And of course, that's an important lessons learned, because if you have this in your plan, one of the things you should look for is to see, how much of the phones that your company gives out can actually support this. And if that percentage is relatively low, then either wait a little while or start notifying your mobile phone department that you're going to have to do some refresh and get people some newer phones. And usually, especially if you kind of target a highest, it's usually quite limited amount of people, and perhaps they're quite happy about the cost of getting a new phone. So it's nice for your poor users once.
I'm curious. I want to touch on that fact real quick, because I'm always curious how phones make it into the corporate or business world for other regions. I'll give you my perspective in the US. This is something that I hear a lot when I'm working with clients and stuff like that is, well, this idea that if the company is going to make me use my phone for something, then they should pay for it, whether it's the phone itself or the service. And I found that has stopped quite a few companies from rolling out, push notification from MFA via an app, or even passkeys and kind of things like that, where it's just this sentiment in the US, it seems, where there is a certain part of the population that has that feeling that, well, if the company's making me do this, then they should pay for that. Is that a similar thing that you experience in your region, or is it a little bit different?
It's definitely, and of course, if you're in a unionized country, either if you're a unionized shop in the US, or if you're for example, in certain markets like Germany, where there's very strong unions, unless the company pays for the phone, there's no ability to. You always have to provide an alternative for your employees and your contractors to the phone, and that is, I would say, is the biggest challenge. One of the biggest challenges that you have when you try to roll out MFA in a global company, and then you also have the fact that in certain regions, smartphones aren't the standard yet. There are certain regions where SMS is okay, but if you say that you need to have a smartphone, then they go like, yeah, but people don't have that yet. And so it's important to go out and ask around your different areas to see, in the Middle East or in China, just what is really acceptable to your population.
And I think that's something that probably people should be thinking about here is passkeys are not a binary thing, right? It's another option for an organization to leverage, to provide to their users or customers or whatever it may be, that I don't think we're at the point yet where only passkeys is the solution that is actually viable in the real world.
No, our experience was that if you look at our population of mobile phones, only about 30% of them actually supported passkeys. Now, of course, that is improving month by month as we roll in newer and newer phones. And again, people can probably survive that they get a bit newer phones, as long as you have the financial planning for it. But today, I would say that's definitely a big challenge if you would start rolling it out on broad front.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big expense to put out there. I mean, it went from, typically like a $30 to maybe $60 RSA token, depending on your bulk pricing, to a, $700 plus, maybe 500 plus, bare minimum smartphone. That's a pretty big difference in pricing, that if you're required to provide that to, your workers, I can see how that might be a roadblock.
Yeah, and the total cost of providing a mobile phone can easily be $50, perhaps even $100 if you take the entire cost. So of course, we're talking about a broad a broad rollout. That is a lot of money for a big company.
Yeah, so that's a pretty big bet to place on passkeys. I'm wondering, what are some of the other challenges? I think the phone typically is the first one that comes up. Maybe there's other things like applications or remote desktop scenarios, things like that maybe you've seen some issues around.
One thing we saw was, and seems to be quite random, depending on how the application is packaged. We have seen running into problems with Teams specifically, which just seems to be a packaging question. So an important lesson learned there is just to do a pilot and roll it out to the kind of a representative population that you want to have it on, and see what kind of problems they run into, and let them run for a few weeks and see. The other thing we saw was that, and this is of course a classical problem, that when we talk about anything that has to do with remote desktop, that has always been a challenge for pass keys or physical keys or anything. And of course that is then very important, because of course what if you want to use this for a higher highest, they usually do some form of remote desktop, and if that doesn't work, then it's not very useful. We also saw that it still seems that the kind of the usability is slightly better for the hardware keys, so it's another factor. There is also a little bit of challenge. You have to write good manuals, because sometimes I think we concluded that you still have the authenticator there as a backup, otherwise bad things start happening. So I think the main thing, if you're interested in this, start with a pilot, investigate how many people's whose phones is actually working with, and then also make sure that you try out all of the more important applications to see that they actually work.
You mentioned the usability component, and this is something that, I work in identity, and I struggle with this sometimes. Is I have multiple passkeys for my Google account, for example, based on whatever device I happen to create them. It might be on my MacBook, it might be on my phone, it might be in my password wallet, or whatever it may be. And I can see that being very confusing for people, where it's like, okay, well, where did I store my passkey? And it seems to me like that's often an awful lot of like, okay, well, that's another password somewhere. Maybe it's not a string that you have to remember, but it's like you have to remember where you put it and what device you used. Do you run into that scenario?
Yes, and also that if you look at it, there's a lot of people who wants to be the single thing that rules them all. So if you have some form of a password vault like application, many of them are also targeting of working in different ways with the passkeys, and then you kind of have an explosion in complexity, an explosion in kind of how do I explain this, and especially if you're many global companies like us, we have 5 major help desks, so you have to make sure that everyone is informed about this, because of course it doesn't take many, especially if we're talking about an admin that failed deployment, for example, because the person couldn't get in. That becomes a big issue quite quickly.
Yeah, I thought about this before, and I remember thinking back to an early consumer identity conference, I think, by Cooper and Cole several years back, and somebody came up to me from like a password vault vendor and asked me what I thought about that. And this was probably 4 or 5 years ago. And I said, and I feel bad about this answer, so I'm putting out there, and I think I've said it before, is like, I just don't know how a password vault survives if we are in this world where there's no passwords. And now that we're here 5 years later, now I see, oh, well, wait a second, we need something to synchronize passkeys between devices. And I think that's an area where a vendor neutral platform like a password vault can be handy for people to say, okay, here's a standardized way that, maybe if I'm rolling out to this a company and I want everybody to use LastPass or Bitwarden or, name your password vault of choice, if they support passkeys, does it make it easier to say, hey, here's the process. Store your passkeys here. They work across devices, and try to avoid some of the confusion that goes along with, well, is this in my iCloud keychain, or is this in my Windows TPM chip? Is this in, in the Android, store, or whatever it might be? I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, so it's yet another case where something has kind of reinvented themselves. And of course, this is an important part of your security standards as well. So if you're using this for the high and highest, then perhaps device bound is the right way to go. That, of course, also then means that the question comes in, once we have this in place, is the attack path that is going to come in now, is it going to be the bind and rebind of passkeys and application devices to the user? So and that then highlights the need for the service desk and how do they authenticate the user. Of course, now that we're kind of past COVID, people can come into the office and then they can show a physical ID, etc. So that's become a little bit better, but there's still a lot of people who might be working quite far away from the closest physical help desk. And then you have to figure out a way to do remote authentication. Of course, in Europe, all the light is coming towards the wallet. So perhaps that is the solution to that specific problem.
Yeah, I guess it's an interesting evolution maybe of that solution and that technology. I feel like this has been a negative conversation only from the fact of we've talked about the challenges, right? Yeah. Like this thing is not easy yet. There's many things still to overcome that are absolutely real world problems that we need to solve for. But let's talk some of the benefits. What do you see as some of the things that maybe, your users or you've seen out in your world that have benefited people to say, oh yeah, this Passkey thing is great, and here's the benefit it provided.
So I think from our perspective, it's mostly that it's a financially viable alternative to hardware keys for admins and to get a phishing resistant solution in place. And I definitely think this is something that is in many cases, we are very close to, if you look at the challenges, they are becoming smaller and smaller per month. So come fall, we're probably going to see, 50% of the phones being able to support it. Of course, depends on how quickly you have your turnovers, etc. So at that point, this is a really good idea to compare to continuing using, SMS or authentication apps or equivalent, at least for some of the really high admins, and provided that your applications can actually support it then, and perhaps you don't do it on your in many cases you want to do a separation anyway between your personal account that you do all your email reading and web browsing and stuff, and your admin account. And then your admin account, you might not be using that many applications there. If you're a primarily an Azure Entra admin, that is what you primarily do, or you log into your PAM solution, that's the only thing you do with that account. So being able to lift a cost-efficient manner the security for those kind of logins and making it really a lot more phishing resistant, that is a huge boon, and especially in tough times when budgets might not be as easy to get to. Not having to make a large investment in hardware keys and getting all the logistics working, it's a significant improvement at a relatively small investment.
If I never have to send a hardware token again out in the real world, I would be very happy about that. That's a pain and suffering I don't wish on any of my fellow ID administrators that are having to do that today. What about some other things? So you mentioned kind of like the administrative use case. Is there a customer thing here that, it's going to be easier maybe for customers to come in? Because I think about it from two different lenses. One is, the internal workforce, whether that's employees, contractors, or any partners and things like that. And then I think about this as a consumer and say, okay, well, I have a password wallet that has thousands of user accounts in there, and I'm constantly being asked to rotate passwords and things like that. Do you see an opportunity maybe for, the consumer side of the world to adopt this maybe and help with that messaging so that it becomes more well known and it becomes a thing that's like, oh yeah, remember this, this thing that was kind of new? Everybody's doing it, kind of like a Face ID or a Touch ID or other biometric approaches.
So I definitely think so. If you look at, of course, a little bit the challenge here is that you see, I think you still see a quite kind of divergence in different worlds, that you have an Apple world and a Microsoft world, etc. I think that part is going to be kind of first coming to more advanced users. And of course, it depends a little bit of what kind of consumers you have. If you have a high security solution, like financial services or equivalent, then you're probably going to have this earlier. But then you might already have a standardized solution for it that's more secure. It's definitely something I would expect coming in as a standard part of CM solutions, again, probably from the fall or from next year, and that people start kind of using it. And in that setup, there's assuming that you have a modern CM solution that supports, there's not a lot of downside of supporting it next to the passwords.
Mm-hmm.
So of course it's just a little bit more straightforward, and you eliminate the risk of credential stuffing. Of course, you could say, okay, what's the difference if I have I generate a strong password and my password manager in my browser anyway? Is there a huge difference? And that's of course debatable, but there is definitely a consumer, customer use case as well.
So I want to have you put on your future prediction hat and tell me, when do you think we'll see, something that's like AI related to passkeys? We talked about earlier, I was like, well, everything's AI, and it was Zero Trust was a couple years ago. Like, do you see an opportunity for AI to help in any way with some of the passkey deployment? And I think anything is on the table as far as I'm concerned.
Yes, so I think what we usually look at when we think about this is, again, the COP and configure. So I definitely think that the configure will keep track of all of your passkeys and make sure that where did I put this passkey that I was supposed to find, and figure that part out. So I do think that there is some AI parts to this as well.
I'm waiting for the logo on somebody's product that says, such and such authentication now with 50% more AI, right? Or something like that. That's trying to get on the hype train for this type of thing. One other thing that I think I want to get into is around, so you're doing this in the real world. You're testing this out. Is there anything that's surprising that you've come up with? It's like, oh, I wasn't expecting that when you started on this journey of passwordless.
So I think one thing that surprised me was that you required such a new OS. Like the fact that my private phone that is only like 6 months, it's not supporting it yet. That was not something I had expected to run in as a major challenge. And it's a little bit, well, at least to me, it was surprising that you needed to have a really new OS to be able to run it in Android, for example. And basically, at least when we looked at this 3 months ago, it was almost like it was only the Google phones that had it supported on a broad front. So that was one surprise. I was also surprised about the fact that the application packaging system matter. That is not something I would have expected.
Yeah, talk to me about that application packaging. You mentioned it before, and I think can you talk a bit more specific about what is the challenge there that we need to overcome still as an industry?
So, and I have to admit that we didn't really figure out exactly why we run into problems. It seems that, so of course, like most enterprises, we package applications before we push them out to our users. Mm-hmm. And it seemed that certain ways of when we packaged up certain applications was not compatible with the passkeys, which is not something I would have expected. So that was a surprise to me, at least.
Do you think that's something that's like OS specific or app specific, or maybe we just don't know yet? Maybe it's both.
it's a little bit unclear, but it seems that if you also how it's installed, if it's installed as admin, requires, then it works. Or I have to admit, we never figured out why it didn't work. We just concluded that it didn't work, and that the next phase is to sit down and see if we can get a few remaining applications. But again, I think for at least initial use, it's mostly about the PAM, and there, well, the high and highest admin. There, it's mostly about how you handle remote workstations. That is a big problem for us, at least.
Well, we've got a lot of listeners all around the world, so maybe we can crowdsource this, and you know, we'll have a link to your LinkedIn profile in our show notes. Maybe if there's advice, at the risk of killing Martin's inbox, you know, if there's ideas, maybe they can reach out with potential solutions.
Sounds like a great idea.
All right, so you've taken this journey on. You're just kind of getting started. What's a piece of advice that you would give to people out there who are in your shoes and they're like, okay, this Passkey thing sounds interesting. What's something that I should be thinking about?
So the first part is to see if you have some form of a CMDB or management of mobile phones. See how many of the mobile phones that are given out by your company are actually supporting it. That's a good starting point. The second thing is to kind of perhaps put out some messages in the Slack channels, whatever you use for, and then suddenly people come bouncing up and says that they want to be part of the pilot. And that's a good way to get an enthusiastic testing force, and then just try it out. Also, one eternal challenge in an enterprise is how do you handle service accounts. So that's another interesting part, or perhaps is a part of the solution to the problem as well. It's a problem that you need 5, 10, 15, 20 solutions, because there's no silver bullet that solves all the application teams need for having some form of a workable solution that is both secure and works in their environment with the specific setup they have. So that's another important thing. And then try it out and be ready to kind of roll it back if it turns out that it doesn't work for the pilot force that you have.
Yeah, make sure you can recover if you need to, right?
Yeah.
Don't delete that password just yet. We're not quite there yet. You need somewhere to recover to go through that process. All right, so those are things that people should be thinking about. Let me put you on the spot here. What's something that people should absolutely not be doing? Like, is there something that's like, oh yeah, we tried that, and my experience, that is not a good idea? Or maybe just a general rule of thumb is, definitely don't do that.
I just would say definitely don't just kind of say, well, today now we have passkeys, their entire company, please stop using them. Then you're going to get a lot of people who's going to go, but my phone doesn't support this. And the usability of these kind of flows and journeys is not really where they should be. So you kind of need to have users that are very forgiving for problems to do this. So I would not roll it out on a broad front just yet. It probably takes a bit more versions before that is clear.
Yeah, dip your toe in the water a little bit, maybe not jump full swing.
Yeah, but I do think it's a good idea to start trying this, because it does improve your phishing resistance quite a lot at a cost that is carryable by the company.
And that's a great goal to strive for. I think, the more we're phishing resistant methods we have out there, I think the better for everybody. Yeah, obviously it helps the user from their account security. It helps support desks and trying to reclaim those, and obviously the costs associated with organizations and data and stuff like that. So definitely supportive of that.
And I think that's an important part. If you look at how you combat the attackers, a lot of it is just trying to start walking towards both increasing your phishing resistance and start putting little speed bumps in front of the attacker. That you will not be able to kind of build the perfect kind of castle that no one will break into. But if you do, for example, look at your Active Directory and say, okay, how do I manage my entitlements? Could it be that I could move from a kind of organic entitlement model where you kind of giving out entitlements a little bit, piece by piece, to a more structured model where you go towards least privilege, at least vaguely reasonable privileges most of the time. And that you cannot do things like separating your normal account from your admin account. Those things does make it much harder for the attacker. It means that they have to spend more time trying to crack the next layer. And also it means that they take them more time and you generate more signal. It gives the cybersecurity teams a lot more chances to pick up on the attack.
Yeah, so, I feel like this is an area where I'm going to ask you if this is something that makes sense in your region, is what we say sometimes in the US is you don't want to be faster. You don't have to outrun the bear. You just have to be faster than your friends.
To a large degree, that's very true. Also here in Europe and I think globally. And also just trying to continuously kind of move forward and do 1,000 small steps get you. It's more of the tortoise probably beats the hare in this case.
That's a good analogy. I mentioned early on that you had presented on this topic at the European conference by Martin Kuppinger puts out for Kuppinger Cole. Is there anything that we missed from this conversation that you think is worth like people understanding and kind of getting out there and part sharing your wisdom on this?
No, it was quite interesting. It was a very full room, which is always nice. And I got E. Mahler was the moderator, which also was nice.
That's great. He's awesome.
Yeah, yes. And I think this is a very interesting topic that is going to really kind of become real, and we're going to see more and more implementations during the next 6 to 12 months. And there is a bit of urgency because it's clear that right now the attackers have gotten a bit of the upper hand. There's a lot of technology advancement that helps the attacker to bypass the phishing filters. The AI is happily helping the attackers to craft beautiful letters, phishing emails. So there is a need to kind of continuing the improvement journey and continuing the resilience. And this is a quite good tool in your toolbox.
Yeah, I mean, this is an area that I think is really just starting to kind of explode. And I'm sure we'll hear more about it at the FIDO Authenticate conference later this year. Hats off to them for getting Microsoft, Google, and Apple all on the same table to kind of figure this out. Yep. Because I think for the longest time, that was a struggle. But we're finally coming together, right, as a group to try and make this better for everybody, both from a security, but also from a usability standpoint. I want to close the conversation out with something that you told me right before we hit record. We end on a show on a lighter note, and you mentioned a moose tower. And I was like, all right, we have to talk about that on the show. Tell me about your moose tower.
So I'm originally from Sweden. And in Sweden, there's a lot of woods and not very many people. And if you're from the more rural parts of Sweden, there is something called the moose hunting season. So it's 1 week and it's different weeks in different parts of Sweden. And basically a large part of the rural population, they then sit for a week with a high-powered rifle and look through moose. And then you sit in one of these towers. And a few years ago, my son wanted a swing. And I could, of course, my backyard, and I live in Amsterdam, so my backyard is very, very small. And I was thinking I could go and buy a swing set, but hey, I found these nice blueprints for how to build a moose hunting tower instead. There's a Swedish organization that tries to promote building with lumber, so they have all of these 3D drawings and everything. And I managed to convince my wife that I was allowed to build a moose hunting tower. So this was during COVID, so I started happily building it. And she was probably thinking that we will never be able to do it, but now it's there. So it's it's about 2 meters high and say 4 square meters or so. And it's now been promoted from being a swing set, still a swing set under the moose tower, and then it's also been it's used now as a strawberry and potato growing towers. Have a vertical farming. It's important when you have a very small backyard. That my wife is American and she has her small patch of grass that she can enjoy, her suburbia, and then I have my potato and strawberry growing moose hunting towers.
And you got this in your backyard in the Amsterdam area. And I guess I'm trying to think of the conversion. So 2 meters is about like what, 6.5 feet or so for the people who are in the US on the
6 feet. Yeah.
Yeah. So like that. So that's pretty high off the ground.
So it's probably not. I asked the neighbor if I was allowed to build, and I said yes, but they didn't probably understand what the moose hunting tower was, so they didn't say anything about it.
They probably looked at you crazy, like, what moose? There's no moose around here.
Yes. So it's a little bit that you walk around in this moose hunting tower when you water your potatoes, and you kind of can look in on all of the neighbors. But of course, when you live in the houses are quite high, the Dutch style high houses, so everyone can look in everyone's backyards anyway. So,
How long did it take you to build it?
So it turned out that the hardest part was the fact that my house is about 1 meter below sea level, and it's built on sand. So the groundwater is very high. So it took me 2 weekends to build it. 1 weekend to do the piling. So there's the 2 meter high tower also goes about 1.5 meter down into the ground.
And did you do this by yourself? Did you have friends help?
Your
son pitch in?
I drafted my wife to do a bit of it, but it was mostly about driving. You take the 2.5 meter long big pieces of wood, and then you put a 0.5 meter of a steel foot onto it, and then you start digging it out first, and then you drive it down. And it stood now for 4 years, so it's a very stable whistling tower.
Interesting. So if you were in Sweden, is this pretty similar to what you'd see there? Would it be more like, could it be taller? Would it be bigger? Like, talk to me about like the Swedish version of it. I guess not the Swedish version, but you know what I mean? Like if it was in Sweden.
So it's built actually from the standard pattern for building these towers. It's probably built a little bit more robust than normally, because normally you build these with kind of leftover lumber you happen to have hanging around. So, but otherwise it's very similar. It's also about, so of course, one part of having a moose hunting tower is that you can see the moose, but the other part is that when you hunt moose, they are very large. They weigh in like a full grown bull might weigh in at like 1,200 pounds or so. So you need a very high power rifle with dum-dum bullets to actually stop them. And if you sit in a tower, you have a downward trajectory of the bullet, which is very good, because if you would be sitting and shooting normally, the bullet could go like 1 kilometer after the moose, and that could be potentially very bad for anything else that happens in the spot. So by putting the shooters a bit up, then they just hitting into the dirt behind the moose, they miss it.
I think another value add that you've got out of this, you start to think about is, you've got almost, it sounds like the beginnings of a perfect zombie apocalypse, like retreat where, you've got the high ground and you've got some area. Maybe you can expand your moose tower to have like, some more rooms to it.
Yeah, I'm trying to convince my wife that I'm allowed to build a missile silo so I can dig downwards. That's not a thing people do. In the center of Amsterdam, you can't really build anything up above ground. So just like in the center of London, there's a lot of people who dig deep downwards to get more volume.
Yeah, sometimes you hear these stories of like tunnels being done underneath the city, and I mean, I can't imagine the effort that it takes to do that. And then, I don't know, the danger, I guess. I'd be afraid like something would collapse on top of me, or, instability in the buildings ahead, above me, or whatever it might be. I'll stick to my, I like the first floor. I'm good with that. Maybe I'll get in the second or third and, be fine with that. But when we start talking about going underground, that's not an area that I'm super interested in.
It's a little bit more dangerous.
Well, you're braver than I am, and thank you so much for taking the time to share your wisdom with us on this. I'm really excited to see kind of where passkeys end up. I feel like it's been hyped now for a couple of years, but we're now starting to see it hit sort of the real world, and real people in the real world are starting to look at it, use it, deploy it, kick the tires, and find the issues, because we have to find those issues to fix them. And so I'm really excited that you're able to take some time with us. And I know that you're 7 hours ahead, so you're approaching, let's see, about 10:30 p.m. roughly. So it's quite late, I would imagine, for you, and want to make sure you get out on time.
Yeah, sounds great. Well, thank you very much for having me, and thank you very much for all your hard work with keeping this podcast on the air.
Well, thank you so much for listening, and thank you to everyone else that listens as well. Hit that like and subscribe button. That's the best way you can help the show. We're on the web, idacpodcast.com. We're on Twitter or X, whatever it's called by the time you listen to this or watch it, IDAC Podcast. Let's see, we're on YouTube, and I'm in the process of trying to set up some DNS entries. So I think I've got idacpodcast.tv. We'll take you right to our YouTube channel to try and make it easy for people to find. And of course, connect with Jim and I on LinkedIn. He had the day off today. He's off in Chicago, hopefully getting some Portillo's chocolate cake, enjoying that while he's there. And he'll be back for a future episode. We'll record it next week. So with that, we'll go ahead and leave it. Thanks, everybody, for watching and or listening, and we'll talk with you all in the next one.
You've been listening to Identity at the Center. We hope you've enjoyed the show. Make sure to like, rate, and review, and we'll be back soon. But in the meantime, hit the website at identityatthecenter.com. See you next time on Identity at the Center.